What's something you wish your family would just admit already?
When I tell you that my family had the audacity to raise their glasses and toast to the winners, while I sat there staring at my water glass like it was the only thing keeping me from losing it. I need you to understand that this wasn't some small oversight or a misstep in wording. It was the latest in a long line of reminders that in their eyes I had always been the extra seat at the table, the one who never quite measured up, the one they could easily forget without feeling even a hint of guilt. And that night was when all of those feelings stacked on top of each other like bricks until the weight was almost suffocating. My brother Evan was glowing as Dad stood to speak about how proud he was that his son had just received another promotion, and then my mother chimed in with that syrupy tone of hers about how Evan was such an inspiration for the whole family. And before I could even process that sting, Maya piped up with some smug comment about how it was so wonderful to see the winners carrying the family name forward, and I realized with a quiet laugh under my breath that not only was I not included in that toast, but my name wasn't even an afterthought, which hit harder than I want to admit even now. I sat there pretending to chew the salad in front of me, nodding politely while inside I was replaying every single time I had gone out of my way to downplay my own life so they wouldn't feel uncomfortable. Every time I stayed quiet when they cut me off mid-sentence, and every time I convinced myself that maybe next holiday would be different. Maybe next dinner they'd notice me, maybe one day they'd raise a glass in my direction, though I guess even then I knew better. So when the toast wrapped up and everyone clinked glasses and laughed at some joke Evan made that wasn't even funny, I felt that knot in my throat forming, the kind that comes when you're angry and humiliated at the same time, and I excused myself early, drove home in silence, and ordered a pizza that tasted like freedom in a greasy cardboard box, because at least that meal didn't come with condescension served on the side. Here's the thing though, as much as I wanted to cry or scream or tell them all where to shove their champagne flutes, I didn't, because I realized in that exact moment that they had no idea what was actually going on in my life, and that thought didn't make me sad. It made me smile in this strange, almost private way, because for once I held something bigger than their little dinner party, something they couldn't brush off, something that was mine and mine alone, at least for a little while longer. And while I sat cross-legged on the couch with that pizza box open and my phone buzzing with photos from the dinner I had left, I thought about how sweet it would be when they eventually realized just how wrong they had been about me. When they would look at me not with pity or dismissal, but with shock, and maybe even a little bit of fear, because the kind of move I was about to make wasn't just another accomplishment to be downplayed, it was the sort of thing that rewrites family pecking orders forever. I didn't tell them that while they were raising their glasses to Evan's latest mid-level promotion, I had been in back-to-back calls for weeks with attorneys and partners hammering out terms that made my stomach churn with both excitement and dread. Because I knew if one thing slipped, if one number got misplaced, the whole thing could collapse, and everything I had built in silence would vanish. But I also knew that if it worked, if it held together the way I believed it would, my name wouldn't just appear in some family group text about holiday plans. It would appear on national news tickers scrolling across television screens. And the numbers attached to it would be large enough that even the relatives who never cared about me would suddenly care, and that thought was almost enough to carry me through the loneliness of that night. So yes, while they toasted the winners and pretended I wasn't sitting at that same table, I didn't argue or fight for a seat in their little narrative, because I had something far more powerful lined up, and they didn't know it yet, but very soon they would. And when they did, there would be no way to unsee it, no way to diminish it, and no way to pretend that I was invisible ever again. And that is exactly why, when I tell you that I smiled eating that pizza alone, I mean it, because for the first time in years I wasn't begging for a place in their version of success. I was quietly holding the kind of card that would flip the entire table upside down, and I knew in my bones that the countdown had already begun. If you want to understand why that toast cut the way it did, you have to know that this wasn't an isolated moment or a single slip where they forgot me in the shuffle of wine glasses and laughter. It was the final straw in a lifetime of small reminders that no matter how hard I worked or what I accomplished, I was always going to be the one they looked past, the one they talked over, the one they brushed aside as though my existence was more of an inconvenience than something to celebrate. And The truth is I had been carrying that weight for so long that I almost convinced myself it was normal. When we were kids, my brother Evan was the golden child without even trying, and I can still hear the way my mother's voice would light up when she described his grades or his sports trophies to anyone who would listen, while my own achievements, which weren't small by any measure, were either ignored entirely or framed as cute little wins that didn't carry the same weight, and the message was clear from the beginning that I could break my back trying to match him, but it would never be enough. Because in this family, the spotlight was permanently rigged to point in his direction. I remember my high school graduation when I walked across the stage with honors, something I had worked for relentlessly while juggling a part-time job, and as soon as I got back to my seat, my parents were already talking about how excited they were for Evan's college football prospects, as though my diploma was just a placeholder in the conversation. And that day I learned not to expect much in the way of recognition from the people whose validation I wanted most. It didn't stop there either, because every milestone I reached was either overshadowed or downplayed in some way, like when I landed my first real job and was so proud to finally be on my own. My dad smiled politely and then spent 20 minutes telling me how Evan's internship was the kind of opportunity that really mattered, or when I bought my first car outright, something I had saved for down to the last cent. And my aunt casually remarked that it was nice for a starter vehicle, while going on and on about the new SUV Evan had gotten, conveniently forgetting that his was financed by my parents and mine was the result of sleepless nights and relentless budgeting. Even family vacations carried the same imbalance because when Evan couldn't make it, there was a sense of disappointment that hung over the entire trip, but when I couldn't attend because I was working double shifts to cover rent, the reaction was a shrug followed by a quick change of subject, and you don't forget that kind of quiet dismissal. It seeps into you until it becomes part of how you see yourself. By the time I was an adult, I had learned to bite my tongue whenever my parents brought up Evan's promotions, bonuses, or new house upgrades, because every time I even hinted at sharing something good from my own life, I'd be met with nods that were so empty they may as well have been eye rolls, and after enough repetitions of that, you start to stop trying, because what's the point of offering up your victories to people who've already decided they don't count? So when they raised their glasses to the winners and excluded me, I didn't argue or push back because I already knew exactly where I stood in their hierarchy, and I was done fighting for a seat at that table. But what they didn't know, what none of them had the slightest clue about, was that while they were busy cheering on Evan's corporate ladder climb, I had been working behind the scenes on something so much larger, something that would rewrite the entire dynamic in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. And that's the part that still makes me smile, because the very people who thought I was invisible were about to be forced to see me on a scale they couldn't ignore, not because I shouted louder or demanded their approval, but because the deal I had been building, the deal I had been pouring my life into while they laughed and drank their champagne, was about to land in a way that would shake every assumption they had ever made about me, and the irony of it all is that they wouldn't even have a chance to prepare. Because the moment the news broke, there would be no rewinding, no downplaying, no brushing me aside, just cold hard facts staring them in the face, and that was going to be the sweetest kind of revenge. And so I stayed quiet that night, and I let them have their toast, because I knew that very soon the real toast would be mine, and they wouldn't even realize it until it was too late to pretend otherwise. By the time my family had raised that glass to celebrate Evan's so-called success, I was already knee-deep in something that none of them could have wrapped their heads around even if I had spelled it out word by word. Because what I had been quietly constructing wasn't just a job change or a small business venture, it was the kind of deal that could alter the trajectory of an entire industry and, at the same time, redefine the way I would be seen forever. Though I had learned long ago not to talk about it around them, since every time I tried to explain my work they either dismissed it as too risky or acted as if I was chasing some hobby that would eventually collapse on me. And the truth is I got tired of wasting my breath on people who weren't willing to listen in the first place. The reality behind the scenes was far from glamorous, because for months I had been waking up before dawn to draft proposals, staying glued to conference calls with investors who seemed ready to walk away at the smallest hiccup, and putting out fires that flared up so often I sometimes wondered if I had willingly thrown myself into chaos without a safety net. Yet every time the fear started to creep in, I reminded myself that this was bigger than any paycheck Evan would ever see in his lifetime. Bigger than the promotions my parents clapped for at family dinners, and it deserved every ounce of energy I had to give. There were moments in the process when I thought the whole thing would collapse, like the week one of the partner firms suddenly pulled out of negotiations, and I sat at my desk staring at the numbers that no longer added up, feeling that sinking weight in my chest that told me months of work might have been for nothing. But instead of panicking publicly, I locked myself in, ran the numbers again, shifted the terms, and found a way to bring in a different backer who turned out to be even stronger than the original, though no one at that dinner table would ever know the sheer amount of grit it took to keep it alive while they were laughing about Evan's new office. It wasn't only the financial risk that kept me awake at night, but the mental toll of constantly being the one to absorb pressure without anyone to lean on. Because when you are the outsider in your family, you stop expecting anyone to ask how you're holding up, so I carried the stress quietly, nodded through family conversations that never once turned to me, and then went home to sit in front of a laptop where contracts blurred together until my eyes burned, all because I believed in what this deal represented, not just financially but symbolically, as proof that I was never the background character they made me out to be. People like to imagine success comes with a clear path and constant confidence, but the truth is I second-guessed myself nearly every day, wondered if I was being reckless, asked myself whether I should scale down and take an easier road. Yet every time those doubts got too loud, I thought about the countless dinners where my achievements went unacknowledged, and that memory was enough to remind me that this wasn't only about business, it was about reclaiming a place I had been denied since childhood, even if I had to carve it out with my own two hands. So when the final stretch came and the papers were ready to be signed, I could feel the tension humming in my veins like static, because I knew that once ink hit those contracts, my life would no longer be the quiet, overlooked existence it had been. And while my family was busy pouring champagne into crystal glasses for Evan, I was in a cramped office surrounded by lawyers and advisors, reviewing line after line until my head spun, fully aware that I was standing on the edge of something they couldn't even imagine existed. That is why, when I think back to that family toast and the way I smiled silently, I know it wasn't resignation, it was restraint, because while they were busy cementing a hierarchy that placed me at the bottom, I had already set into motion a shift so large it would rip through that hierarchy like paper, and I didn't need to shout about it or demand their recognition. I only needed patience, because in less than a day the entire narrative would flip, and there would be no way for them to rewrite history once the ink was dry and the headlines started rolling. And maybe that was the sweetest part of all, the knowledge that while I had been invisible to them for years, I had been building something in silence that would make me impossible to ignore, and as terrifying as those final hours of negotiations were, with every signature I saw slide across the table, I could already picture the look on their faces when the news broke, and for the first time in my life I felt no desire to fight for their approval, only the satisfaction of knowing I had finally built a world where I didn't need it. The night after the dinner, while my family was probably still replaying the glow of their toast to the winners and basking in the comfortable certainty that Evan was once again the shining star of the family story, I sat cross-legged on my couch with that greasy pizza box open beside me, scrolling through documents one last time, waiting for the confirmation email that would mark the end of months of negotiations and sleepless nights, and as ridiculous as it sounds, I almost laughed at how ordinary the moment felt considering how extraordinary the outcome was about to be, because when the deal finally closed, it wasn't confetti or fireworks that greeted me, it was the soft buzz of my phone vibrating on the table. The first alert came from CNBC, a breaking headline that flashed my name in bold letters, paired with a number that still looked surreal even to me, and before I could fully process it, Bloomberg followed, then Reuters. Then a flood of financial outlets that all carried the same story. I had officially closed a $120 million deal, a figure so staggering it almost didn't feel real, and yet there it was. Not in some fantasy or a plan I hoped would someday work, but cemented in cold, undeniable facts that the entire country could now see. I remember sitting back against the couch cushions, staring at my name on the screen with a strange mix of disbelief and quiet triumph, because while my family was clinking glasses in Evan's honor, I had been holding this card close to my chest. And now that it was public, there was no way to shove me back into the shadows or pretend I didn't exist, and for the first time in my life, I felt the scales shift completely in my favor without me even needing to move a muscle. And then it happened. The family group chat that usually ignored me suddenly lit up like a slot machine, my phone vibrating nonstop as message after message poured in, and I almost didn't want to open it, because I already knew the whiplash I was about to witness. But curiosity won, and there it was, my aunt, the same one who had called Evan the family's pride, now typing in all caps about how proud she was of me, my parents, who had barely noticed when I bought my first home, suddenly writing paragraphs about how they always knew I was destined for something big, Evan himself chiming in with a forced, "Congratulations, sis," as if he hadn't sat across from me the night before, soaking up applause that I was never invited to share. It was wild how fast the narrative changed, how people who had never so much as asked me what I was working on were suddenly claiming they'd always believed in me, and instead of replying with the gratitude they probably expected, I set the phone down on the table, took another slice of pizza, and let them stew in their own sudden enthusiasm, because after years of begging for recognition, I realized in that moment that I didn't need their words and, in fact, their desperation to latch onto my success was more satisfying than any praise they could have offered. The best part was knowing that this wasn't just a number on a screen but a headline that couldn't be erased, a record that existed outside the family bubble where I had been invisible for so long, and while they scrambled to rewrite their roles in my story, the truth was there for the entire world to see, a truth that required no explanation from me, no pleading, no defense, because when the world names you as the architect of a deal worth $120 million, you no longer have to fight for a seat at any table, not even the one that once made you feel small. I didn't answer them that night, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I wanted them to feel the silence, to sit with the weight of how little they had valued me until the world forced their hand. And as I closed the chat without replying, I thought about how fitting it was that after years of being told to stay quiet and let Evan shine, my greatest revenge came not from shouting back, but from saying nothing at all, because in that silence they finally heard me louder than they ever had before. And that was when I realized this was only the beginning, because the headlines were still spreading, the calls from investors were already starting to pile up, and while my family tried to recalibrate their opinions overnight, I knew the real victory was not just that I had closed the deal, but that I had done it without them, without their approval, without their help, and that was something no group chat apology or sudden burst of pride could ever erase. In the days that followed the breaking news, the shift in my family's behavior was so abrupt it almost gave me whiplash, because the same people who could barely muster up a polite nod when I talked about my life were now tripping over themselves to rewrite the past, suddenly acting as if they had always supported me, as if the years of silence, dismissive comments, and constant comparisons to Evan had never happened, and the group chat that once functioned as little more than a highlight reel for his latest promotion or purchase was now overflowing with attempts to center me, every message dripping with a desperation that was impossible to miss. My aunt, the one who had been so proud to declare Evan the family's beacon, began sending me articles she had clipped from newspapers, attaching notes about how she had saved them for the scrapbook, as if she had ever once considered saving anything I had done before the dollar signs made it undeniable. And my parents were calling every day, leaving voicemails filled with an over-the-top pride that almost sounded rehearsed, insisting they always knew I had it in me, while completely ignoring the fact that only a week earlier I had been left sitting at that dinner table with my name unspoken during their toast to the winners. Evan was the hardest to read, because while his messages said congratulations and his words insisted he was proud, the tone carried that sharp edge I had known my whole life, that quiet resentment when the spotlight no longer belonged to him. And even in his attempts to sound gracious there was an undercurrent of competition, as though he was already strategizing how to reclaim the throne that had so effortlessly slipped from his grip. The irony was that I didn't even care about their approval anymore, Not because I had hardened myself against it entirely, but because I realized I had already outgrown the need to measure my worth by their recognition. And the very thing I had craved for so long, the acknowledgement that I was enough, had arrived not through their voices, but through headlines, contracts, and the undeniable reality of the work I had built in silence, which meant that their sudden praise didn't feel like validation. It felt like proof of how shallow their judgment had always been. So instead of rushing to respond or bending under the weight of their new expectations, I made a choice that felt both small and monumental. I stayed silent, letting their words hang unanswered in the digital air, because I wanted them to sit with the reality that my success did not hinge on their approval, and when I finally did reply, I made sure my message carried the weight of everything I had never said aloud. I waited 3 full days before I typed a single sentence, and when I finally did, it wasn't a gushing thank you or an open-armed embrace of their sudden pride. It was a screenshot of the deal announcement with the closing figure highlighted, accompanied by the words, "Not bad for the one you forgot to toast." And with that, I put my phone down and walked away, because I knew that nothing else needed to be said. The fallout was immediate. My mother called within minutes, her voice trembling as she tried to smooth over the past with excuses about misunderstandings and poor phrasing. My father insisted I was misinterpreting their intent at the dinner. My aunt sent paragraphs about how family dynamics can be complicated, and Evan went silent for hours before finally writing back something passive-aggressive about how money doesn't change character, though the irony was that character had never been his strength to begin with. But for once, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself, didn't feel the need to explain why their neglect had scarred me, didn't even feel tempted to accept their flimsy revisions of history. Because I understood that the power I had gained didn't come from rubbing the wind in their faces or dismantling their excuses. It came from knowing that I no longer needed any of it, that I had reached a place where their approval was irrelevant. And that realization was more liberating than any apology could ever be. The final move, the one that sealed everything for me, wasn't a dramatic confrontation or some cinematic speech that left everyone speechless. It was the quiet act of letting them sit with the truth, refusing to let them rewrite the story in their favor, and holding firm in the knowledge that I had built my victory without them, that the world had recognized me even when they wouldn't, and that I no longer owed them the courtesy of pretending their sudden support meant anything. And maybe that's what real revenge looks like, not screaming, not fighting, not demanding recognition from people determined to withhold it, but standing tall in the silence, knowing that the proof of your worth is so undeniable it forces them to confront what they tried for years not to see, and leaving them with the bitter realization that the only reason they can't ignore you anymore is because the world won't let them. So when I think back to that dinner, to the toast raised for the winners, while I sat in silence, I no longer feel the sting of being left out, because I know the story didn't end there, and the final chapter wasn't written by them, it was written by me. With every sleepless night, every risk I took, and every ounce of determination they never bothered to notice, and as much as they might try to catch up now, the truth is they will always be a step behind, because I didn't just prove them wrong, I proved to myself that I never needed their glass raised in my direction to be a winner.